The morning mist clung to the Argonne forest like a shroud, concealing the greatest military gamble in American history. It was September 26, 1918, and along a 24-mile front stretching from the Meuse River to the edge of the Champagne region, over 1 million American soldiers crouched in their trenches, waiting for the signal that would change the course of the Great War forever. General John Joseph Pershing stood in his command post, studying the maps that had consumed his thoughts for months. The Meuse-Argonne sector represented the most heavily fortified position on the Western Front, a labyrinth of concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and machine gun nests that the Germans had spent for years perfecting. The enemy had named it the Hindenburg Line, and they believed it to be impregnable. Private First Class Thomas Murphy from Chicago pressed his back against the cold earth of the trench wall, his hands trembling as he gripped his Springfield rifle. Around him, the 1st Division soldiers whispered prayers and checked their equipment one final time. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with the earthy scent of wet soil, and the sickly sweet odor of gas masks hanging from their belts died at precisely 5:30 in the morning. The silence shattered. 2,700 American artillery pieces erupted in a coordinated barrage that could be heard 50 miles away. The ground trembled as if the earth itself was screaming, and the sky lit up with flashes of orange and white that turned night into a hellish dawn. For 3 hours, the bombardment continued, sending over 4 million shells into the German positions, according to historical records from the U.S. Army Center of Military History. This opening bombardment represented the largest concentration of American firepower ever assembled at that time. The sheer scale of the assault demonstrated America's industrial might and military determination to European allies, who had questioned the New World's commitment to the war. When the guns finally fell silent, the eerie quiet felt more terrifying than the thunder that had preceded it. Sergeants blew their whistles, and along the entire front, American soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began their advance into the unknown. The Argonne forest loomed before them like a green wall of death, its ancient trees concealing horrors that would test the courage of an entire generation. Murphy found himself running alongside men from every corner of America: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, cowboys from Texas. They were united by a common purpose that transcended their different backgrounds, to prove that American soldiers could stand toe-to-toe with the battle-hardened veterans of Europe and emerge victorious. The German response was swift and devastating. Machine guns chattered from hidden positions, cutting down advancing soldiers like wheat before a scythe. Artillery shells whistled overhead, exploding in geysers of mud and shrapnel. The carefully planned advance quickly devolved into chaos as units became separated in the dense undergrowth and officers fell victim to sniper fire. Yet the Americans pressed forward, their determination fueled by months of training and an unshakable belief in their cause. They had come to France to end the war, and nothing would stop them from achieving that goal. The Battle of the Argonne had begun, and with it, America's transformation from an emerging power to a global military force that would reshape the 20th century. The Argonne forest revealed its true nature as American forces pushed deeper into its shadowy depths. What military planners had marked as simple woodland on their maps was actually a nightmare maze of ravines, thick undergrowth, and natural barriers that channeled attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. The Germans had spent years transforming this ancient hunting ground into a death trap. Captain James Harrison of the 28th Division led his company through a narrow valley. When the forest erupted in gunfire, hidden machine gun nests opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously, their interlocking fields of fire creating an inescapable web of death. Harrison watched in horror as half his men fell in the first 30 seconds, their bodies crumpling onto the forest floor like discarded marionettes. The German defensive strategy was diabolical in its effectiveness. They had positioned their machine guns to create crossfire patterns that made advance seemingly impossible. Concrete bunkers, camouflaged with branches and moss, were practically invisible until they began spitting fire. Barbed wire, some of it electrified, stretched between trees at heights designed to catch soldiers at chest level. Sergeant Alvin York, a Tennessee marksman, who had initially sought exemption from military service as a conscientious objector, found himself leading a patrol through a particularly dense section of forest. His unit had been tasked with silencing a German machine gun position that had been decimating American advances for 2 days. York's rural hunting skills, honed in the mountains of Tennessee, would soon make him the most famous American soldier of the war. The weather added another layer of misery to the already hellish conditions. Rain had been falling intermittently for days, turning the forest floor into a muddy quagmire that sucked at soldiers' boots and made silent movement impossible. The constant dampness seeped through uniforms, chilling men to the bone and making rest impossible. Wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated immediately often died not from their injuries, but from exposure. Communication between units became almost impossible in the dense forest. Telephone lines were constantly cut by artillery and runners. Carrying messages between commanders often disappeared into the green maze, never to be seen again. Officers found themselves making critical decisions based on incomplete information, sometimes ordering attacks on positions that had already been abandoned or reinforced. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical casualties. The forest seemed to swallow sound, creating an environment where the crack of a twig could mean death, and every shadow might conceal an enemy soldier. Men who had shown exemplary courage in open battle found themselves paralyzed by fear in the claustrophobic confines of the Argonne. Despite these horrific conditions, American forces continued their advance. The 3rd Division captured the village of Montfaucon on September 27th. Though the victory came at tremendous cost, the ancient fortress town, perched on a hill overlooking the battlefield, had served as Kaiser Wilhelm's personal observation post earlier in the war. Its capture was symbolically important, but the strategic value was questionable given the casualties required to take it. Private Murphy, who had survived the initial assault, found himself separated from his unit during the attack on Montfaucon. He spent 3 days moving through the forest alone, surviving on rainwater and emergency rations, before finally reaching American lines. His experience was typical of thousands of soldiers who became lost in the maze-like terrain. The German defenders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were making their last stand. They had been ordered to hold the Hindenburg Line at all costs, and they were prepared to die rather than retreat. This determination, combined with their advantageous positions, made every yard of advance a costly victory for the attacking Americans. October 8, 1918, dawned gray and cold in the Argonne forest, marking the beginning of what would become one of the most extraordinary displays of American heroism in military history. The battle had been raging for nearly 2 weeks, and both sides were exhausted, but the Americans had learned to adapt to the forest's deadly embrace. Sergeant York's patrol had spent the night in a shell crater, listening to the sounds of German voices echoing through the trees. At dawn, they moved forward to investigate, creeping through the underbrush with the stealth of experienced hunters. What they discovered changed the course of the battle and created an American legend. 23 German soldiers occupied a machine gun position that commanded a crucial valley. York's patrol had stumbled upon the position's rear, catching the enemy completely by surprise. In the firefight that followed, York's marksmanship skills proved decisive. Using his rifle with deadly precision, he eliminated German machine gunners one by one, each shot calculated and deliberate. When a German major led a charge with fixed bayonets, York drew his pistol and stopped the assault single-handedly. His shooting was so accurate that he killed 6 attacking soldiers in rapid succession, causing the remaining Germans to surrender. By the end of the engagement, York had killed 25 enemy soldiers and captured 132 prisoners, along with 35 machine guns. The impact of York's action extended far beyond the tactical victory. News of his heroism spread quickly through American lines, providing a desperately needed morale boost to exhausted soldiers. Here was proof that individual courage and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds, that American fighting spirit could triumph over German military science. Meanwhile, Another drama was unfolding deeper in the forest. Major Charles Whittlesey's battalion, which would later be known as the Lost Battalion, found themselves surrounded by German forces after an advance that had pushed too far ahead of supporting units. 554 men from the 77th Division were trapped in a small pocket of forest, completely cut off from American lines. The situation was desperate. German forces attacked the isolated Americans repeatedly, using machine guns, mortars, and even flamethrowers to try to dislodge them from their position. Food and water ran out quickly, and medical supplies were exhausted treating the growing number of wounded. The men had to drink from muddy shell holes and eat whatever they could find in the forest. Communication with American headquarters was maintained by carrier pigeons, one of which, named Cher Ami, became legendary for completing her mission despite being shot through the breast and losing a leg. The pigeon carried a message that read, "We are along the road parallel to 2764. Our own artillery is dropping directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The reference to this heroic action comes from military records maintained by the National Archives, which documented how American artillery had mistakenly targeted the Lost Battalion's position after German forces had moved around them. The friendly fire incident added another layer of tragedy to an already desperate situation. For 5 days, Whittlesey's men held their position against overwhelming odds. They fought off repeated German attacks, tended to their wounded without medical supplies, and maintained their cohesion despite being outnumbered and surrounded. Their determination became a symbol of American resilience. Under the most adverse conditions, the rescue of the Lost Battalion required a coordinated effort involving multiple divisions. American forces launched attacks from 3 directions, fighting through the same dense forest that had claimed so many lives. The relief operation cost over 600 casualties, but it demonstrated the American military's commitment to leaving no soldier behind. When the survivors were finally reached, only 194 men remained unwounded. The rest had been killed or injured during the 5-day ordeal, yet their sacrifice had not been in vain. The Lost Battalion's stand had tied down significant German forces and prevented enemy reinforcements from reaching other threatened sectors. These acts of heroism, both individual and collective, began to shift the balance of the battle. American forces were learning to fight in the forest, adapting their tactics to the unique challenges of the terrain. More importantly, they were proving to themselves and their allies that they possessed the courage and determination necessary to defeat a skilled and desperate enemy. November 1, 1918, marked a crucial turning point in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, as American forces finally began to break through the German defensive lines that had held them for over a month. The cost had been enormous, over 90,000 American casualties, but the relentless pressure was finally producing results. General Pershing had reorganized his forces after the initial setbacks, replacing inexperienced divisions with seasoned troops and implementing new tactics better suited to forest warfare. The 2nd Division, veterans of Below Wood, took over a critical sector, bringing with them hard-earned knowledge of fighting in dense terrain. The breakthrough came in an unexpected sector. The 5th Division, attacking through the village of Brieulles-sur-Meuse, encountered lighter resistance than anticipated. German forces, exhausted by weeks of constant fighting and running low on supplies, had begun to thin their lines. American soldiers, many of them immigrants fighting for their adopted country, pressed their advantage with fierce determination. Corporal Antonio Rossi, whose family had emigrated from Italy 10 years earlier, led his squad through a gap in the German wire. Behind them followed waves of American infantry, finally able to advance without being channeled into predetermined killing zones. The sight of open ground ahead felt like a miracle. After weeks of fighting for every yard, the German Fourth Army, which had held the sector since 1914, was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure. Reports from German military archives, referenced in post-war historical studies, revealed that many units were operating at less than half strength. Ammunition was running low, and the influenza pandemic that was sweeping through Europe had weakened German forces just as much as American ones. But the enemy was far from defeated. General Max von Gallwitz, commanding the German forces in the sector, ordered a series of counterattacks designed to restore the defensive line. German stormtroopers, elite units trained in infiltration tactics, launched desperate assaults against American positions throughout the first week of November. The fighting reached a new level of intensity. American machine gunners, many of them recent immigrants who spoke little English, held their positions against overwhelming odds. The diversity of the American forces, men from every state and dozens of countries of origin, became a source of strength rather than weakness. They were fighting not just for military objectives, but for the promise of America itself. Private Michael O'Brien, whose parents had fled poverty in Ireland, found himself defending a crossroads that had become crucial to the American advance. His machine gun team held off 3 German counterattacks, firing until their barrel glowed red-hot and their ammunition ran dangerously low. O'Brien's determination to prove himself worthy of his adopted country was shared by thousands of immigrants serving in American ranks. The breakthrough at Brioulles opened a gap that American forces quickly exploited. The 1st Division, Pershing's elite Big Red One, poured through the opening and began rolling up the German flank. For the first time since the offensive began, American forces were fighting on relatively open ground where their superior numbers and equipment could be brought to bear effectively. Artillery played a crucial role in the breakthrough. American gunners, who had learned hard lessons about coordinating fire support in forest terrain, began systematically destroying German strongpoints. The sound of American shells whizzing overhead, which had once filled soldiers with dread when they fell short, now provided reassurance that help was coming. The psychological impact of the breakthrough was as important as the tactical advantage. German soldiers, who had held their positions with incredible tenacity for weeks, began to doubt their ability to stop the American advance. Prisoners taken during this period spoke of low morale and questions about Germany's ability to continue the war. American forces, energized by their success, pressed forward with renewed vigor. Units that had been decimated earlier in the campaign were reinforced and thrown back into the fight. The 3rd Division captured the strategically important town of Beaugency, while the 78th Division advanced through the forest toward Grand Pre. The momentum was clearly shifting in favor of the Americans. What had begun as a desperate gamble was becoming a decisive victory. The German defensive system, which had seemed impregnable just weeks earlier, was beginning to collapse under the sustained pressure of American attacks. November 7th, 1918, brought news that electrified the American forces still fighting in the Argonne forest. Reports were circulating that German representatives were negotiating an armistice with the Allied powers. The end of the war seemed within reach, but the fighting continued with undiminished ferocity as both sides sought to improve their positions before any ceasefire took effect. The American advance had gained momentum throughout the first week of November. The 5th Corps, under the command of General Charles Summerall, had broken through the German lines near Stenay and was advancing rapidly toward Sedan. The symbolic importance of recapturing the city where France had suffered its humiliating defeat in 1870 could not be overstated. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, commanding a tank battalion, led the mechanized spearhead of the American advance. His tanks, though primitive by later standards, provided crucial support to infantry units as they pushed through the final German defensive positions. Patton's aggressive tactics and personal courage made him a legend among the soldiers he supported. The German army was in full retreat, but it remained a dangerous opponent. Rearguard actions were fought with desperate intensity, as German commanders tried to delay the American advance long enough to establish new defensive positions. Machine gun teams sacrificed themselves to buy time for their retreating comrades, and artillery units fired until their guns were overrun. Staff Sergeant William Thompson, an African-American soldier serving with the 369th Infantry Regiment, found himself at the forefront of the advance. Despite facing discrimination within the American military, Thompson and his fellow soldiers of the Harlem Hellfighters had proven themselves to be among the most effective combat units. In the American Expeditionary Force, the integration of African American troops into combat roles had been controversial, but their performance in the Argonne eliminated any doubts about their fighting ability. Thompson's regiment had been attached to French forces earlier in the war and had earned the respect of their European allies through their courage and effectiveness in combat. The advance toward Sedan became a race between American and French forces, both eager to claim the honor of liberating the symbolic city. Competition between allies added an element of urgency to the final phase of the offensive as commanders pushed their exhausted troops to maintain the pace of advance. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat the wounded as the battle continued. The influenza pandemic that was sweeping through Europe had reached the front lines, adding disease to the list of enemies facing American forces. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties from both combat and illness. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female physicians serving near the front lines, worked 18-hour shifts treating wounded soldiers. Her dedication represented the contribution of American women to the war effort. Though their service was often overlooked in official accounts, the courage of nurses and medical personnel was as crucial to victory as the bravery of combat soldiers. The German retreat was not without cost to the Americans. Booby traps and delayed action mines claimed victims even after German forces had withdrawn. Engineers worked around the clock to clear roads and bridges, many of which had been destroyed by the retreating enemy. The infrastructure of war had to be rebuilt. Even as the fighting continued, artillery units found themselves in the unusual position of advancing faster than infantry, a reversal of traditional roles that demonstrated how completely the German defensive system had collapsed. American gunners were able to bring their weapons to bear on retreating German columns, inflicting heavy casualties on an enemy that had lost its ability to fight a coordinated defense. The psychological impact of the German retreat was profound. American soldiers, who had spent weeks fighting for every yard of ground, suddenly found themselves advancing miles in a single day. The transformation from static warfare to mobile operations required rapid adaptation, but American forces proved equal to the challenge. Communication between units became crucial as the advance accelerated. Radio technology was still in its infancy, so most messages were still carried by runners or transmitted by field telephone. The courage of communication personnel, who often had to cross dangerous ground to maintain contact between units, was essential to the success of the final push. As November 10th dawned, American forces were within artillery range of Sedan. The city that had witnessed France's defeat 48 years earlier was about to be liberated by France's newest ally. The symbolism was not lost on soldiers, who understood the historical significance of their achievement. November 11th, 1918, at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, an eerie silence descended over the Argonne forest. After 47 days of continuous fighting, the guns had finally fallen silent. The armistice that had been negotiated in a railway car in Compiègne Forest had taken effect, bringing an end to the bloodiest conflict in human history. The silence was almost deafening to soldiers who had lived with the constant thunder of artillery for weeks. Men who had been preparing for another assault stood in their positions, uncertain of what to do next. Some laughed, others wept, and many simply stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend that the ordeal was finally over. Private Thomas Murphy, who had survived the entire offensive, found himself in a forward position just 500 yards from German lines, across the barbed wire and shell holes. He could see German soldiers emerging from their trenches. As bewildered as he was by the sudden end to the fighting, the enemies who had been trying to kill each other just moments before now stared at each other in mutual recognition of their shared humanity. The cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive had been enormous. Over 26,000 American soldiers had been killed, and more than 95,000 had been wounded. The casualty rate exceeded anything the American military had experienced in previous conflicts, but the strategic results justified the sacrifice. The offensive had broken the back of German resistance and hastened the end of the war. General Pershing, who had staked his reputation on the success of the offensive, could finally claim vindication. His insistence on maintaining American forces as an independent army rather than feeding them piecemeal into British and French units, had proven correct. The American First Army had demonstrated that New World soldiers could match the fighting ability of any European force. The transformation of the American military during the offensive was remarkable. Units that had entered the forest as inexperienced troops emerged as battle-hardened veterans. The lessons learned in the Argonne would shape American military doctrine for decades to come, influencing everything from training methods to tactical doctrine. Sergeant Alvin York, whose heroism had made him famous throughout the world, found himself overwhelmed by the attention his actions had generated. The Tennessee marksman who had initially sought exemption from military service had become the most celebrated American soldier of the war. His story embodied the transformation of American forces from uncertain novices to confident warriors. The Lost Battalion survivors, those who had endured 5 days of hell in the forest, were finally able to receive proper medical treatment and recognition for their sacrifice. Major Whittlesey, who had led them through their ordeal, would later receive the Medal of Honor, though the psychological scars of the experience would haunt him for the rest of his life. Medical personnel continued their work even after the fighting ended. Thousands of wounded soldiers required treatment, and the influenza pandemic that had swept through the ranks needed attention. The dedication of doctors and nurses during the offensive had saved countless lives and demonstrated the crucial role of medical support in modern warfare. The armistice terms required German forces to withdraw from occupied territory, but the process was complicated by the chaos of retreat. American forces remained in position, ready to resume fighting if the Germans violated the ceasefire terms. The transition from war to peace was not immediate, and tensions remained high for weeks. After the guns fell silent, the impact of the Meuse-Argonne offensive extended far beyond the immediate military results. The performance of American forces had established the United States as a major military power, capable of projecting force on a global scale. The confidence gained in the Argonne would influence American foreign policy for generations to come. European allies who had initially questioned American military capability now viewed the United States with new respect. The citizen soldiers who had crossed the Atlantic to fight in someone else's war had proven themselves worthy of the democratic ideals they represented. The old world had been saved by the new world, and the balance of global power had shifted permanently. The Argonne Forest, which had witnessed so much suffering and heroism, began the slow process of healing. Nature would eventually reclaim the battlefield, but the memory of what had transpired there would endure. The American cemetery at Romagne-Sous-Montfaucon would become a permanent reminder of the price paid for victory. The sun rose on November 12, 1918, over a transformed world. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had ended, but its impact would resonate through history far beyond the immediate military victory. In the space of 47 days, American forces had not only helped end the Great War, but had fundamentally altered the United States' position in the global order. The statistics of the offensive were staggering. Over 1 million American soldiers had participated in the campaign, making it the largest military operation in American history to that point. The 26,000 American deaths represented the highest casualty count of any American battle, exceeding even the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. Yet these numbers, horrific as they were, told only part of the story. The true significance of the Meuse-Argonne offensive lay in its demonstration of American military capability and national resolve. When the United States had entered the war in April 1917, European allies had welcomed American industrial capacity and financial resources, but had questioned whether American soldiers could match the fighting ability of battle-hardened European armies. The Argonne had answered that question definitively. Private Murphy, who had survived the entire offensive, would return to Chicago a changed man. Like thousands of his fellow veterans, he carried physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime, but he also carried the knowledge that he had been part of something greater than himself, that his sacrifice had contributed to a victory that would reshape the world. The American military had learned crucial lessons in the Argonne that would influence its development for decades to come. the importance of coordinated artillery support, the challenges of forest warfare, and the value of small unit tactics had all been demonstrated at tremendous cost. These lessons would be remembered when American forces again faced similar challenges. In future conflicts, the performance of diverse American forces in the offensive had profound implications for American society. Immigrants who had fought for their adopted country had proven their loyalty and courage beyond question. African American soldiers, despite facing discrimination within their own military, had demonstrated exceptional valor and effectiveness. The shared sacrifice of combat had created bonds that transcended racial and ethnic divisions. General Pershing's insistence on maintaining American forces as an independent army had been vindicated by the success of the offensive. The American Expeditionary Force had proven that New World military organizations could operate effectively on European battlefields. This demonstration of independent capability would influence American military policy throughout the 20th century. The strategic impact of the offensive extended beyond the immediate military results. The breakthrough at Meuse, Argonne had hastened the collapse of German resistance and shortened the war by months. The psychological effect on German forces and civilian population had been as important as the tactical victories, contributing to the internal collapse that forced Germany to seek an armistice. The international implications of American success in the Argonne were enormous. European powers, which had dominated global politics for centuries, now had to acknowledge the United States as an equal partner in world affairs. The military capability demonstrated in the offensive gave weight to American diplomatic positions and helped establish the United States as a global superpower. The technological innovations employed during the offensive had advanced military science significantly. American artillery techniques, developed through hard experience in the forest, would influence gunnery doctrine for decades. The use of aircraft for reconnaissance and close support had demonstrated the potential of air power. In future conflicts, the human cost of the offensive was memorialized in the American cemetery at Romagny-sur-Faucon, where over 14,000 American soldiers found their final resting place. The rows of white crosses and stars of David standing in perfect formation served as a permanent reminder of the price paid for victory. Each marker represented not just a life lost, but a family forever changed by the sacrifice. The veterans who returned from the Argonne carried with them a transformation that extended far beyond military experience. They had witnessed the worst of human nature in the carnage of modern warfare, but they had also seen the best in the courage and sacrifice of their comrades. These men would become the leaders of American society in the decades following the war, their experiences shaping the nation's response to future challenges. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had proven that democratic values could triumph over authoritarian militarism, that citizen soldiers could match the effectiveness of professional armies, and that the United States possessed the military capability to influence global events. These lessons would be remembered when America again faced existential challenges. In the decades to come, the deadly struggle in the Argonne Forest had earned America the global respect that General Pershing had sought. The price had been enormous, but the victory had established the United States as a military power capable of projecting force anywhere in the world. The citizen soldiers who had fought in the forest had not only won a battle, but had secured America's place as a leader of the free world for generations to come.